Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, learning time. So we're doing part 2 of Basil II right now. I'd recommend watching part 1, but that's up to you. Battle of Orontes, 994. Original link to the video from History March, top of the description. My name's Connor if you're new. Let's get started. Let's learn. We're good.
In 985, Emperor Basil II deposed his uncle and former advisor, Basil Lacapenus. Having been the power behind the throne for over a decade, while his two nephews ruled in name only, the old eunuch had no intentions of retiring soon. But Lacapenus had sensed early on that young Basil II aspired to govern himself. Alarmed by the ambition of the legitimate emperor as much as Lacapenus, the aristocracy of Asia Minor began conspiring with the eunuch. The so-called Anatolian dynasty, or the powerful ones, rallied behind a general who had helped the two Basils crush a revolt in the late 970s. Now bearing the title of Domesticos of the Schools, the illustrious commander Bardas Phocas held command over all of Asia Minor and posed a severe challenge to the rule of the young Macedonian emperor. However, before long, young Basil uncovered his uncle's attempts to create an anti-imperial coalition. The old Lacapenus was condemned and exiled, and for once, Basil II held a firm grip over the empire's affairs. Yet soon, the tide would turn against the young emperor, and the Byzantine world would be engulfed in a vicious civil strife. Having hoped that his first Bulgarian expedition would bolster his reputation, Basil's military inexperience achieved the exact opposite. The emperor's position couldn't have been more precarious after the debacle at the Trajan's Gates in August 986. Worse, after the deposition of his uncle, the emperor was bold enough to demote several influential officials. Most importantly, Bardas Phocas, who now, at least on paper, commanded only the city of Antioch and its surroundings. However, the entirety of Asia Minor was loyal to their former commander. Joining Phocas's anti-loyalist camp were Leo Melicinos, whose hasty retreat had caused a disaster at Trajan's Gate, and the former governor of Italy, a man named Delphinus. Around the same time, Bardas Skleros, the former rival of Bardas Phocas, arrived in Meliten from Baghdad. This time, however, the old general was here on the invite of Phocas. The two men had negotiated a truce, and Skleros soon headed towards Cappadocia, where his small force of Arab tribesmen and Armenians could link with Phocas's large army. Upon arriving in Caesarea, however, old Skleros was captured and imprisoned. Having eliminated a potential threat to his power, Arab tribesmen and Armenians could the two men had negotiated a truce, and Skleros soon headed towards Cappadocia. No time, however, the old general was here on the invite of Phocas.
I thought he was going to join him.
This time, however, the old general was here on the invite of Phocas. The two men had negotiated a truce, and Skleros soon headed towards Cappadocia, where his small force of Arab tribesmen and Armenians could link with Phocas's large army. Upon arriving in Caesarea, however, old Skleros was captured and imprisoned. Having eliminated a potential threat to his power.
What? So he just like, did I understand that right? He just like, all right, hey, come over here, let's join armies. Oh, hey, how's it going? Shackle. Thanks for the army, now go to prison.
Bardas Phocas proclaimed himself emperor.
Did I get that
August
right?
987. and headed toward claimed himself emperor in August 987 and headed towards the Marmara Sea. The commander divided his armies into two. He planned to blockade the Dardanelles with his part of the army, while the second half, commanded by Delphinus, was to head towards the Asian shore of the Dardanelles. But the ponderous march of the two anti-loyalist forces, combined with their inability to achieve naval supremacy, gave Basil enough time to plan a course of action carefully. Having 2/3 of his empire turned against him, the young emperor had no other choice but to seek foreign aid. As Delphinus and his men encamped near Chrysopolis, Basil entered negotiations with the son of the great Svetoslav, a certain Prince Vladimir, who just so happened to be interested in converting his people, the Rus, to Orthodox Christianity. Vladimir agreed to help Basil in return for his sister's hand in marriage, the very same one that had been promised to the Bulgarian nobleman Aaron. Securing a wedding with a princess from the Macedonian dynasty was a feat that even the Holy Roman emperors couldn't achieve. This secured him military aid from Vladimir in the form of 6,000 battle-hardened Slavs and Scandinavians who headed for the Golden Horn to join Basil's army. Although marrying off his sister to a foreign heathen may have been a blow to the family's prestige, the emperor knew that the balance of the civil war and his place on the throne hung on this union. By December 988, an army of 6,000 battle-hardened Slavs and Scandinavians anchored in the Golden Horn. In the meantime, Phocas, who had unsuccessfully...
It's the Volga or the Dnieper River that's like a connection from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Or is it neither? Or both?
Successfully Golden Horn. In the meantime, Phocas, who had unsuccessfully tried to secure Abydos, headed towards Chrysopolis, leaving Leo Melicinos behind in charge of the siege. However, before the general could reach far, Basil, now reinforced by his new elite Scandinavian guard, crossed the Dardanelles and headed towards the enemy camp. On an early January morning, a squadron of Basil's men sprayed the shore near Delphinus's base with Greek fire.
You know that surprise mother... The Dexter guy? The meme? Surprise, mother... forget it. It just made me think of that.
Enemy camp. On an early January morning, a squadron of Basil's men sprayed the shore near Delphinus's base with Greek fire, denying the anti-loyalists a way out. Basil's main army quickly routed their challengers in a short and decisive clash. Delphinus was impaled alive in what would become the first of Basil's many gruesome punishments.
The impaling,
a small loyalist army led by the Armenian Gregory Taranites ravaged the rebel-controlled territories. But upon reaching the Euphrates River, the Armenians were defeated by Phocas's son, who commanded an army of fresh recruits, generously delivered by the Georgian kingdom of Tau. Unfortunately for Nikephoros Phocas, when rumors of the defeat at Chrysopolis spread throughout Anatolia, his men deserted en masse, returning to their Georgian homeland. In the meantime, the self-proclaimed emperor, Phocas, had returned to his camp near Abydos, intensifying the city's siege. By April, Basil and his army had already landed nearby, and Bardas had no choice but to face the young emperor in battle. However, at the very beginning of the ensuing clash, Phocas suffered a seizure, immediately dying.
What?
News of their command.
It's not that I'm upset that he died. It's just that I thought, like, that guy had always been, like, a side character in this so far, and the last episode. That I was kind of hoping a big clash and a dying in battle or something, but Nope.
Suffered a seizure, immediately dying. News of their commander's demise spread mass panic among the Anatolian army. Phocas's soldiers immediately broke their formation. Hotly pursued by imperial squadrons and routed bit by bit, much of the rebel force was crushed then and there.
That was so anticlimactic, him dying to a seizure.
On the 13th of April, in front of Abydos. With that victory, Basil had secured his position on the throne. In an unusual display of mercy, much of the rebel command, including Leo Melisinos, lived to see another day. Basil's dealings in Anatolia weren't over, however. In Cappadocia, Skleros was released from captivity and put in charge of the rebellion. Old and half-blind, the senior general secured a truce with Basil, ending the revolt and retiring in Thrace. The final holdout of the rebellion, the city of Antioch, surrendered soon after.
That went so well for Basil. Like, the entire thing went super well.
With the rebellion crushed,
flawlessly,
Basil led a campaign against the king of Tau, David III, who had supported Phocas's revolt. Furthermore, the old monarch had used the chaos of the civil war to put his nephew Bagrat on the throne of the neighboring kingdom of Abkhazia. David had named his who had supported Phocas's revolt. Furthermore, the old monarch had used the chaos of the civil war to put his nephew Bagrat on the throne of the neighboring kingdom of Abkhazia. David had named his relative an heir to his kingdom, meaning that the two Georgian kingdoms of Tau and Abkhazia were to merge upon his death. This troubled Basil II, who forced King David to accept his peace terms after a brief and poorly recorded campaign. The old monarch was to keep his crown on one significant condition. Basil was to be adopted by David and named heir to his kingdom. And thus, almost effortlessly, Basil had secured the incorporation of an entirely new province, the size of Cilicia.
That went...
By late 989...
The past, 3-4 minutes of this video went from Basil II having, two, thirds of his... two, people with armies going towards him and, to him getting support from the Russian guy and getting those Scandinavian Russian soldiers, mercenary soldiers, and then defeating one easily. The other guy died of a stroke, of a seizure, and then he goes over here and that happens, and then he gets those two guys in the Caucasus and the northeast. Wow.
The emperor had already returned to Constantinople. Now he could finally focus on what would become his life's work, restoring the old Balkan provinces of the empire and defeating Samuel of Bulgaria once and for all. Slowed down by a year due to an earthquake in Constantinople, Basil finally departed for Bulgaria in 991. The emperor's strategy was to spend as much time as possible in Bulgaria's heartland, Macedonia. Reinforced by his small Varangian army and a massive regular army, the emperor invaded Bulgaria. Instead of inflicting a single crippling defeat on Samuel, the Romans relied on a more time-consuming but less risky course of action.
I don't know really how great Basil is as a commander yet, or military strategist leader. He didn't do that great in Bulgaria earlier in the past episode. Although it was his first kind of testing, right? And then his only main, seemed to be a risky and something where he had to make a decision was the initial attack on the camp when he got the reinforcements from Russia, Scandinavia. And so that was good. But everything else just kind of seemed to either luckily have the seizure of the guy, and then everyone else just kind of seeing the fruitlessness of it and abandoning or surrendering. And so I'm curious to see if he has any brilliant strategic moves to come.
Gradually reduced on a more time-consuming but less risky course of action, gradually reducing Bulgarian strongholds in Macedonia, did Bulgaria. Instead of inflicting a single crippling defeat on Samuel, the Romans relied on a more time-consuming but less risky course of action, gradually reducing Bulgarian strongholds in Macedonia over the course of many months. On the other hand, Samuel decided to leave only a tiny defensive force in Bulgaria, knowing that the rugged terrain of Macedonia would do much of the defense for him, and decided on an offensive strategy. He besieged and captured Byzantine strongholds around Thessaloniki, Dyrrhachium, and Thessaly. However, Basil's initiative in Macedonia was marked by great success. By 992, much of western Macedonia was in Byzantine hands. The major stronghold of Varia was reconquered, and Bulgaria's eunuch, Tsar Roman, was captured during a minor confrontation. As you may remember from our previous episode, Roman was the brother of Boris II, who had been arrested and dethroned by Emperor John Zimisces in 971. The two brothers had escaped from Byzantine captivity. However, only the castrated Roman had made it to Sredets, where he was proclaimed Emperor of Bulgaria. Roman's title was mostly symbolic, as many of the roles of a monarch were filled by Samuel. Sources are dubious about Roman's fate after his capture in 991. Some claim that the Bulgarian Tsar died in captivity, while others state that the Tsar was handed out a governorship in Anatolia, the latter being more likely. After the successes of 991, Basil continuously wintered in Bulgaria for the next 3 years, gradually capturing fortress after fortress. In the meantime, Samuel's offensive efforts also proved fruitful, with the Bulgarians seizing multiple border strongholds, including the major city of Dyrrhachium. In the end, luck turned out to be on Samuel's side, when disturbing news from the east forced Basil to return and winter in Constantinople in late 994. While Basil was gradually reducing Bulgarian control over Macedonia, a war over the Byzantine vassal emirate of Aleppo was in full motion. This conflict had ended poorly for Basil's Duke of Antioch, an old general named Michael Baucis. In the years prior, the emperor had refused to appoint another Domestikos of the East, fearing another rebellion. Instead, Basil delegated the duties of protecting the Asian frontier to the Duke of Antioch. This made for a sluggish Byzantine reaction to significant eastern threats, as Baucis had to turn directly to Constantinople for assistance. The Fatimid Caliph Al-Aziz exploited this situation, vigorously attempting to transform the Emirate of Aleppo into yet another province in his transcontinental empire. To accomplish this task, the Caliph appointed Manu Takin, one of his most talented generals, as governor of Damascus. Starting in 992, the Turkic general would frequently invade the Arab Emirate of Aleppo, defeating General Baucis in 2 encounters and capturing the major fortress of Apamea. Yet, Aleppo's residents vigorously resisted Takin's attempts to siege their capital city. After spending the winter of 993 and 994 in Damascus, the Fatimid general assembled a large force, planning on capturing Aleppo and repelling the city's Christian allies once and for all. Reinforced by a party led by Leo Melisinos, the Duke of Antioch's enlarged army of close to 10,000 was still no match for Manu Takin's force, which in all probability was several times larger. Realizing his position, Baucis and Leo marched south to the stronghold of Anartus. The Byzantine army was reinforced by a garrison sent from Aleppo, which linked with the main force en route. After drawing local recruits from the area around Anartus, Baucis felt confident enough to engage Manu Takin's force. The Fatimid general reacted quickly, leaving a small party behind to continue the ongoing siege of Aleppo, while he moved to intercept the Romans. By September, the two armies had neared each other. Michael Bortzes and Melisinos had taken position next to a ford on the Orontes River. Manu Takin's multi-ethnic force assembled on the opposite bank. Supposedly, Bortzes was able to position his men better. Despite that, the Fatimids eventually gained the initiative. Separated from the main Byzantine army, a contingent of Aleppan recruits faced a Fatimid squadron of Bedouins and Berbers located on the opposite bank. This section of the battlefield was the first to see action, as the Berbers crossed a ford and charged straight at their fellow Muslims. Frightened by the overwhelming enemy numbers, the Aleppans fled, exposing the Byzantine rear. In the meantime, Bortzes' main force had engaged Manu Takin's men. Unfortunately for the Romans, the Berbers abstained from pursuing the fleeing Aleppans, instead choosing to assist their general. Soon the Byzantines were struck on two sides. Having already lost as many as 5,000 men, the Duke of the East ordered a retreat, fleeing towards his base in Antioch.
Muslim armies, like, no joke in this. For some reason, not for some reason, because they're relatively new, right? Well, it was like 300 years. Maybe not that new, actually. Almost like 400 years ago, right? But the initial Muslim conquests, when Muhammad was around, I don't know why. I figured they would be more easily taken on by you know, Byzantine armies or like European based armies. Not the case. Like, it feels like 9 out of 10 encounters I learn about where it's like a Byzantine or someone else against a you know, Caliphate army, the Caliphate wins like every time. It's crazy.
This victory enabled the Fatimids to continue their siege on Aleppo. Manu Takin had no plans of lifting the blockade anytime soon. The Turkic general prepared to winter in enemy territory. He was supposedly so dedicated to conquering the city that he ordered the construction of baths and bazaars within his camp. Realizing the severity of the situation, the emperor, who had just arrived in Constantinople, began planning a course of action. A potential fall of Aleppo would open the gates for a Fatimid conquest of Antioch, erasing 3 centuries of Byzantine progress in the area. Yet Basil was no longer...
Delasinos' defeat forced Basil II to personally lead yet another campaign in Syria the following year. He would arrive in mid-September. The rebellious Bardas Phokas was a member of the prominent Cappadocian family and the nephew of Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas. Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim's farthest-reaching diplomatic mission was to Song, China. Wow. Captain Domiyat reached Shandong in 1008 AD. He presented the caliph's gifts to the Chinese Emperor Zhenxiang. This reestablished diplomatic relations between Egypt and China that had been lost during the collapse of the Tang dynasty in 907.
Longer an inexperienced prince, the past 10 years had transformed him into an imposing figure. And in the coming spring, the emperor would have an opportunity to showcase his abilities again.
Should we just get right into it, guys? Let's do it. Let's do it.
In the early 990s, Basil II began revealing his military capabilities. A stickler for discipline, the emperor's endless inspections of his troops transformed them into a well-oiled military machine. This proved vital in the long campaign in Bulgaria, where Byzantine forces successfully conquered important fortresses in the enemy's heartland. However, by late 994, Basil was forced to leave the Duke of Thessaloniki in charge of the Western Army and head back to Constantinople. The emperor's attention was urgently needed in the east. A Fatimid army under Governor Manu Takin had crippled local Byzantine forces, forcing Duke Michael Bertzes to retreat to Antioch. By autumn of 994, the important city of Aleppo was besieged by the Fatimid governor of Syria. The blockade caused severe food shortages, and the population was on the verge of surrendering. If Aleppo were to fall, the southeastern frontier would be exposed, threatening to erase 3 centuries of Byzantine progress in the area. Basil needed to act fast. Knowing that time was of the essence, Basil spent the winter recruiting and drilling the troops. Once the snow melted, the army made way to relieve Aleppo. Each man was mounted and had a spare horse or mule. The restless march was carefully planned and would become one of Basil's most impressive military feats. A journey from Constantinople to Syria that typically took 2 months was completed in 16 days. Basil's plan to surprise Manu Takin with speed worked. Outmaneuvered, the Fatimid general hastily burned his camp, lifted the siege, and left for his base at Damascus. With Aleppo saved without a single swing of the sword, Basil continued the campaign of 995 by reducing Fatimid gains in Syria and besieging the major Levantine port city of Tripoli. But back west, the newly appointed Duke of Thessaloniki, Gregory Taronites, proved utterly incapable of checking the advance of Emperor Samuel, and he was now holed up behind the walls of the provincial capital. He tasked his son Asotes with stopping the Bulgarian raids in the environs of Thessaloniki. Unfortunately for the Duke, his son was swiftly defeated and captured by Samuel. This obliged Gregory to sally forth, taking most of the city's garrison with him, and confront Samuel in battle. After winning a brief skirmish, the Byzantines chased after the retreating Bulgarians, only to be lured into an ambush. Gregory was cut down, together with most of his men. Word of the events in Macedonia quickly traveled to Syria.
Jesus
At
Christ.
Tripoli, Basil's attempts to encircle the city proved unsuccessful, as he could not blockade Fatimid naval supply lines to the fortress.
That seemed like such a freaking blunder. Was that like the entirety of the defenses now while Basil was gone to fight the Fatimids? Just sent, destroyed, captured, sent, destroyed, and now who's there?
At Tripoli, Basil's attempts to encircle the city proved unsuccessful, as he could not blockade Fatimid naval supply lines to the fortress. Realizing he must head back, he lifted the siege and marshaled his army to Constantinople. But despite news of the setbacks in the west, Basil opted for a slow and deliberate march back home. Having not adequately visited Anatolia since childhood, the emperor used this opportunity to make his presence felt. On a vast estate at Caesarea, he was received by Constantine Melianos. A lavish feast was held for the entire imperial army until they finally went on their way. Along his itinerary to the capital, Basil continued appearing unannounced at the gates of powerful Anatolian aristocrats, and for good reason. His reforms that aimed at aiding small landowners decreased the influence of the aristocracy, which undoubtedly displeased many powerful men. Thus, these friendly visits with the imperial donors, and for good reason, unannounced at the gates that aimed at aiding small landowners, and for good reason. His reforms that aimed at aiding small landowners decreased the influence of the aristocracy, which undoubtedly displeased many powerful men. Thus, these friendly visits with the imperial army in tow went a long way in reaffirming any wavering loyalties to the emperor. Once in Constantinople, urgent matters of the state needed tending to, keeping Basil busy in the capital. Meanwhile, Samuel had inflicted another defeat, cutting short the career of Gregory's successor, John Caldos, after defeating and capturing him in yet another ambush. By this time, Samuel made ambushing Byzantine generals his trademark. Confident during the campaigning season of 996, he ventured deep into enemy territory with the bulk of his army, cutting a path of destruction as far as the Peloponnese. Word of the movements of a large Bulgarian army reached Constantinople. Basil sensed an opportunity to cripple Samuel in a single blow, now that his forces were concentrated in one place.
And you can't really
The emperor appointed
escape.
the relatively unknown Nikephoros Ouranos as his new general in the west. His task was to harass and intercept the Bulgarian army on their way home.
Oh, I would have thought you'd want to...
Moving ever closer to the Bulgarian
Cut them
frontier,
off.
Samuel was lured into a false sense of security after he forded the river Spertsios, which swelled after several days of heavy rain. Encamped close to the river and confident that Ouranos would not be able to cross it, Samuel neglected to conduct a proper watch over the Byzantines on the opposite bank. Unbeknownst to the Bulgarian leadership, on July 16th, Ouranos discovered a ford in the river. The Byzantine army crossed to the opposite bank at dusk and headed towards the enemy camp. Ouranos carefully arrayed his troops in pitch black so as to not arouse any suspicion. In a masterfully executed night attack, the Byzantines achieved total surprise. A chaotic melee followed, and the unprepared Bulgarians were crushed next to their encampment. According to some sources, Samuel and his son, Gavril Radomir, evaded capture by lying among the dead bodies of their soldiers. Sometime
That's
during
crazy.
the night, they snuck out as the Byzantines were
That
looting
worked.
the dead, barely escaping alive to return to their capital of Ohrid.
I can't believe that worked. Wow.
With most of his army dead or captured, the Bulgarian leader offered peace to Basil. Despite achieving a decisive victory,
Part of me is
the
kind of
emperor
happy he escaped, because he's been wrecking fools over here.
Despite achieving a decisive victory, the emperor accepted the terms, aware that rising tensions in the east prevented him from building momentum against Bulgaria. Basil's prior expedition into Syria provoked the Fatimid Caliph Al-Aziz to lead the army himself. He gathered a massive fleet to support the invasion, but luckily for the Byzantines, almost all his ships perished in a fire that broke out in the harbor. Undeterred, Al-Aziz ordered the construction of another fleet, but fate again favored the Byzantines.
Another fire?
As the Caliph died in 996, before he had the chance to begin the invasion. With his passing, civil war engulfed the Caliphate, as
Good
the
news
Turks
for,
and Berber factions
Basil.
vied for dominance. Using the Fatimid
Berber. Is Berber an Arab sort of, are Berbers a section of Arab people? Berbers. I should know this. Pirate?
infighting, Basil
Anyone?
replaced the ineffective... Using the Fatimid infighting, Basil replaced the ineffective Michael Bertzes with the more aggressive Damian Dalasinos. Over the next year and a half, the new Duke of Antioch succeeded in capturing several Fatimid fortifications. But his attempts to capture Tripoli faced the same obstacles that prevented Basil from capturing the city,
Reinforcement from sea?
as the supplies were brought in via the sea. In early 997, Basil expanded the scope of the operations in Syria. The Byzantines assisted an anti-Fatimid revolt in the old Phoenician city of Tyre. In the meantime, a major fire broke out in the
The bridge to Terabithia, to Tyre,
city of Tyre.
or Acre, or Tyre.
In the meantime, a major fire broke out in the strategically important
Alexander the
city
Great.
of Apamea, destroying much of its provisions. The Duke of Antioch promptly moved to capture the city, sensing that without supplies, Apamea would surrender after a short siege. But the forces from the Emirate of Aleppo reacted faster, reaching the city first to claim it for their emir. By the time Dalasinos reached Apamea, the host from Aleppo was already encamped in front of the walls. To prevent their Muslim vassal from expanding, the Byzantines forced the Aleppans to lift the siege. The smaller Muslim host had no option but to comply, but they purposefully left their supplies in the camp as they marched off, which was soon claimed by the garrison of Apamea. With a force of around 10,000, Dalasinos proceeded with the plan to starve the city into submission. Meanwhile, the newly appointed governor of Damascus, Jaysh ibn Samsama, was busy crushing the Byzantine-backed anti-Fatimid revolt in Tyre. After successfully entering the city, the Fatimid general moved to Damascus, taking command of an 11,000-strong relief force and heading towards Apamea. Much like 4 years ago, the Fatimid and Byzantine armies faced each other on the opposite banks of the Orontes River, not far from the city of Apamea. Stationed on the river's western ford, Samsama's army was divided into 3 main lines. The Bedouin cavalry on the left wing, under the command of a certain Mayor the Slav.
And Bedouin, Berber. I need to know these terms.
On the left wing, under the command of a certain Mayor the Slav. A large center comprised of Iranian infantrymen, bolstered by reserve cavalry of 500 slave soldiers, under the command of Bishara the Ilkshadid. Further south, likely located on the high ground, was the right wing of the Fatimid army, commanded by the governor of Damascus himself, consisting of Berber and Bedouin horsemen. The exact Byzantine battle formation remains uncertain. However, it is known that the Romans took the initiative. Their center formation was the first to ford the river and engage the Fatimid center. The well-drilled Dalasinos' men quickly gained the upper hand. Fatimid infantry struggled to hold back the enemy. Their formation broke, and the troops started fleeing. However, this is when the lack of discipline in the Roman ranks began to show, as many of the men broke formation to pursue the fleeing enemy, cutting down as many as 2,000. Seeing the bulk of the center fleeing, the Fatimid right and left wings followed suit. Only the feared Ghilman cavalry of 500 remained in place, heroically resisting a much larger Byzantine contingent for hours. This is when a Kurdish officer from Bishara spotted Dalasinos. Seeing an opportunity to turn the tide of the battle, he rode towards the imperial standard. Accompanied by his 2 sons and his personal bodyguards, the Kurdish officer approached the small hill where the Roman general was positioned. Dalasinos, overconfident and believing that the day was won, foolishly assumed that the Kurd and his entourage were coming to surrender. The general approached the Fatimid officer and his small Ghilman retinue, but before Dalasinos had the chance to speak, a Kurdish rider threw a spear at him, killing him instantly. As the Duke of Antioch crumbled to the ground, the Fatimids captured his 2 sons. Word of the death of Dalasinos quickly made its way to the retreating Fatimid forces. Shouting, "The enemy of God is dead," the Fatimids halted their retreat and turned.
So in an instance like this, where you want your enemy to know that this guy has been killed, do you I mean, could they have seen it? Because they're going to speak different languages. Like, do you want to make sure someone was there, goes and tells them or something?
The enemy
so you
of
get
God
that?
is dead. The Fatimids halted their retreat and turned on the Byzantines. Reinforced by the Apamean garrison that sallied forth from the fortification, Samsama managed to stabilize his line and regain the initiative. Caught out of formation, the morale of the Roman soldiers dropped, and they began retreating in panic. The clash soon turned into a massacre, and by the end of the day, 6,000 Byzantine troops lay strewn across the field. A very high casualty figure by medieval standards.
Jeez.
Luckily for the Romans, Samsama did not fully exploit his victory at Apamea, having to return to Damascus to deal with internal issues. To the west, the war between the Bulgarians and Romans had resumed in 997. Once again, the emperor would be forced to deal with wars on two fronts. But it would be these challenges that would turn Basil II into the greatest emperor of the Macedonian dynasty. But more on that in the next episode.
Great videos, guys. Of course, we're going to watch part 4. Not going to do it right after this, though. Would appreciate any comments down below. Again, the Caliphate armies just are really good or something. Really cool. Would appreciate, again, any answers to any questions I had, any comments at all, and hopefully I'll see you guys next video. Bye, guys.